All right, looks like we're recording.
Okay,
Well,
great.
good morning, and thanks for joining me this morning. I'm excited to talk this morning. Looking forward to our discussion. So I'm going to let you, Mims, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. So go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll go from there.
Oh, okay. So my name is Mims Rouse, and I'm currently the executive director for the Coalition of Black Men, and I'm also the founder of a edutech, Afrotech software company that develops software to support the um, relationship between mentors and mentees, focusing on Black male youth. And my past has been um, in discrimination. Um, really, that started, the substantive work started in working with the federal government, enforcing equal employment opportunity among federal contractors, and being educated on the laws that um, provide recognition and guidance on how to best eliminate discrimination in the workforce. And I worked in a corporate setting, Fortune 500 company, where I was tasked with um, mostly with prevention, um, and also helping to shine light on areas that um, potentially pose an issue for that institution. And with the Coalition of Black Men, um, focusing on four areas: health and wellness, education, economic development, and mentoring. And generally, I'm trying to uplift the Black community and do some consulting work also, um, leading students through the African American experience, helping them understand the generational um, aspect um, of what we're talking about today, which is really not discrimination, but something in its most broadest sense, and that's white supremacy, which is just so much more encompassing than individual discrimination and discrimination on the at the workplace.
Yeah, yeah. You've been in activism for quite a while. You've been working in this field, and our first meeting was on a plane. I was headed to India, and you were, I think, headed home to Florida for a visit. And so we had a conversation, I think, toward the end of that flight it was. And for me, that was a very pivotal moment in my life. Um, I've never considered myself to be a racist, and until that moment, I thought everything was fine in my own life. And then our conversation got me thinking, and really helped me examine my own life, and really helped me to not be afraid of opening that door in my life and seeing what was behind it, to be willing to say, okay, let's seek the truth for myself and see what's hidden in my life. And then from there, we can really begin to break down the hidden areas of racism that we may not realize we have. And that started for me. And then our conversations, we've had several of them the last few months, and that's been really beneficial for me. So this morning, our goal, my goal for our discussion, is to really to seek truth. As believers, my goal for myself and my church is to seek the truth. So that's where we're going this morning. Hopefully we can explore this a little more. Obviously, it's a big topic, a lot of things to discuss, but to at least scratch the surface and think about it. So, and my thought as we seek truth is that if we are, as Christians, seeking real truth, we shouldn't be afraid to find that truth. If it's truth that we want, when we find it, it shouldn't be something that's frightening, because we're seeking the truth in everything that we do. So I'm excited for our discussion, and I'm glad that you were willing to have this discussion as an expert, really, in your field, in the Black male experience in this area. I think I want to start with the idea that you, of course, are an expert in this field. As a church, we're trying to explore how to respond to what we're seeing and how to help. I think there's some confusion about what we've seen in the last couple weeks of activism and marches. Would you describe what you see as happening in what's going on in Portland and other cities around the world?
Well, what's happening actually comes in waves, from what I've experienced and from what I know. And so, and it comes about, periodically, at least every 5 or so years. The last person that really where it was this palpable, it was Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and before then, way back when, it was Emmett Till. And so, unfortunately, it's caused, it's not until a Black man dies that people's consciousness are awakened. But, there's always been whites, Christian leaders, and you and I have talked about this multiple times, and more so, it's my position that white male pastors have a unique role to play in this. During abolition times, it was many English abolitionists who put pressure on government to end racism and slavery. I think they now go by the title of just Friends, but I think it was Friends of Christ. It was one of the pillars within their faith, abolition of slavery. And so I think that plays a unique role. But where we are now is we're at another apex for this particular incident, and it's not until we rid ourselves of racism that we're going to stop having these cycles. And so I feel like we're just this is another incident that we're exploring right now. And I think that we should use that momentum to do more substantive work in breaking down structures of white supremacy so that we don't revisit these.
Yeah, it seems like hopefully that every time we see one of those peaks, that hopefully we're making a step up,
Mm-hmm.
that we're not losing progress every time, it kind of fades from consciousness and remembrance in the white community, that hopefully every time we encounter this, we're making progress. And obviously the goal is to continue to move forward and progress. For us, obviously it's at the forefront of our mind. It's in the news every day. And we're thinking about it. So my goal in our discussion is to become better informed. How can we come to a better understanding, become better educated? I feel like for me, in our first conversation, I was underinformed, uneducated. I wasn't opposed to learning, but I hadn't taken any steps. And I think that's where I still am. I'm still learning. So how can we become better educated, come to a better understanding of what we're seeing, and how to be participants in making progress on racial issues? How can we become better educated, I guess is my question.
Yeah, so I think it starts with what you mentioned initially. That's deciding whether or not you as an individual and you as a body in Christ um, is a truth seeker. And so if that is the case, then um, I think that you'll be able to walk into this understanding. I think that many times um, individuals in the white population is no different, that we feel like we are um, good people, and that there's, and so when anything comes up that challenges that goodness, that we become defensive of that goodness because we've lived with this idea for so long. And so I think more than anything, what if we started with the concept of being um, as um, morally um, bankrupt as the Bible says that we are, and that without Christ, we're all fit for nothing, right? If we started with that, even in this area as well, then I think that that will open up hearts and minds. Um, how can we be good without Christ? The world says that, tries to tell us that basically all people are good, and that's a complete affront to Christian teachings.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so
Yeah, opening that door. And that's even as I think about, my journey on this, it was that moment where I was, feeling this defensiveness and wondering why am I defensive here? But it is that shame, or that feeling of, oh, I'm a bad person if I open that door and find hidden racism, or hidden ways I've benefited from white supremacy without knowing it. If I open that door and see that, I'm now a bad person. It brings shame, and so the temptation is to close the door and not explore it. But as you say, truth seekers, if we want to see the truth, if we want to move forward in our walk, we have to be willing to open that door and see what's inside of our hearts, and then let Christ change that, because we are all not basically good, but basically evil, which is the reason that Christ came in the first place, to change our hearts. So yeah, I know that's the starting point. We have to be willing to not be afraid, to not hide from what we might see if we open that door. So I think that's key. So one of the things that is scary to look at is the idea of systemic racism and white supremacy. How have you seen it and experienced that? I know in the white experience, it's kind of hidden if we're not looking for it, but certainly you've experienced that. So could you explain an example or two of ways you've seen it in other people's lives or experienced it in your own life?
yeah, and so one of the, I hate to speak in sound bites, but
Sure.
as long as it's truthful, then it's just appropriate. So what's come up is that oftentimes we're taught to look for the shark in the water, when white supremacy is actually the ocean, right? And so we're always looking for that moment where white supremacy pops its head, without really thinking that it's everything. And that's where that truth seeking comes into play, because the United States was founded on racism. So if the very core of, in the history of the United States is this idea of white supremacy, and not just the United States, because Europe set out to rule the world. Africa has, I think, 54 countries in it, and there's only one of those countries who wasn't um, officially ruled by a white country. And that's why so many Africans, their native language, their official language were European languages, French, um, Italian, um, German. You name it. And so, and that's the water. And so, because many of these countries are now progressive or stable, or I wouldn't even say stable. I would say progressive in the white European sense. Then there, I believe that there is this perception that now white supremacy doesn't exist, when really it's just now everything for those organizations. And so for me, it's I was in a neighborhood, and it was where and I'm looking for an address for someone, because I've come to realize that the address that I was given was not correct. And without realizing it, someone had come up to my window, a white female had come up to my window and asked me, because she helped me, and then she was trailed by her husband. And it didn't feel like they were being just helpful. It felt like they needed to get me on my way. And so I've had multiple instances like that. I've had the instance where, I've been piled on top of by police officers. And that's, and looking back, that was forgivable, until the last police officer who got off, pointed guns and everything. And the last one who got off of me took his knee and drilled it into my back. And afterwards gave his partner high fives as they put me in the police car. And it was all because I climbed through my parents' window. I was a freshman in college, and I didn't have a key to the house. And I was home for the weekend, and I knew that we'd left the window open in the back of the house. And so I climbed through the window, and the neighbor saw me and called the police. And so I understand why that occurred, but I'll never understand why in 7 or 8 police officers piling on top of me, and one of them felt compelled to drive his knee in my back. And something that I had felt for a number of years afterwards. And so, it's driving along with one of my white female friends, and I was oblivious to the moment, but she caught it immediately. We were driving back on campus, and we're at a red light, and the turn signal wasn't functioning. And so the cop in front of us held us up for, I don't know how many minutes. And we're in Florida, so the sun is beaming. And I was like, wow, this is taking a long time. And I was looking at her demeanor, and it was becoming just more and more intense. And as we drove onto campus, she yelled out the window, "racist." And then it was then that I recognized that, oh yeah, that was probably something racist, just holding us up because maybe he didn't feel like that she and I should be in the same car together. It's walking in the neighborhood and a police officer telling me that someone called the police, and that they saw someone strange walking in the neighborhood, and and not realizing it in the moment that he was talking about me. So I informed him that I honestly hadn't saw anything suspicious, but I called him if I did. And it wasn't until he smiled that I recognized that he was actually talking about me. And so, like I said, it's the water. It's being in a place where people think that you shouldn't be, and them nudging you over to where they think they should, that they think you should be. And those are just the most subtle things.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it hard, and that's why it's helpful for me to hear your experiences, because I'll tell you an experience that I had with a police officer that would have ended differently if I had been Black. I believe I was visiting my grandma. She lives in Lake Oswego, and she was off at Starbucks or something. So I drove her car to pick up a few things at the store. And it was toward the evening, and I'd forgotten to turn on my lights. And so one of the police officers pulled me over. He was very polite, very kind, and I didn't have the registration. I didn't have my license with me because I had just jumped in. I'd forgotten it was my grandma's car. My wallet was in my other car, and I didn't know where she had any of that. But the police officer talked me through that, and I did remember my license number, but I couldn't find the registration. He ran the plates, and he said, "Hey, make sure next time you have your license and registration on you." And he let me go. And I look back at that and I think, oh, that's everyone's experience. But that's not the case. If I had been Black, and again, not every police officer, I'm certainly not saying that, and you're not saying that every police officer is overtly racist, but there would have been a different protocol if I had been Black, I believe. And so I experienced something that, I guess if white supremacy and racism is the water, I'm on the boat that is lifting me up out of the water, that it actually lifts me up and gives me a bit of an advantage in some situations in life. And so for me, to hear your experiences is essential, because my experience is different. Which is unfortunate, but the reality. So it helps me to hear some of your experiences. And in this moment, we're talking about policing, but certainly in other areas of life, you experience that systemic racism, that white supremacy as well. And it's hidden. Sometimes it's hidden behind politeness. Someone appearing polite, like the lady who knocked on your car door or car window. It's masked in a variety of things. That's what makes it hard to see. So obviously we want to come to a better awareness of it, and be willing to see it when we open that door. As far as believers and our church, we want to participate in making progress. And obviously this conversation it can be hard to hear for some who are hearing it. Defensiveness is probably right there, saying, well, no, I don't think that I'm like that, or I don't see that. But I think it's important to believe an experience is different than my own, because my experience is different than yours, but that doesn't negate yours at all. I must listen, I must hear, and I must believe. And so if someone's listening and they're at that point where they're saying, okay, I'm willing to open this door, and I see these things and I want to see these things, what are some ways that we can learn more, perhaps? Some articles, some places we can go. Give a couple things that somebody who wants to explore this a little more, is there somewhere you'd recommend they start?
Yeah, so there's this, I think for the Christian church, the movies I recommended to you was great, because I do think that as Christians, everything should have some type of Christian foundation to it. And so it's called White Savior. And I think that that's a really great movie to help awaken people's senses. And I think that more than anything, we should be concerned about doing nothing. I think that too often we see things and we do nothing about it. And what we're doing, unfortunately, is that we're desensitizing ourselves to it. And we get really good at ignoring things. When George Floyd, when I saw the video of him being killed, it didn't, it grieved me, but it didn't motivate me to action, because I have seen so many other types of movies like that. And then it had concerned me that, you know, I was so desensitized to those types of images. And so I think that we need an exploration in that sense. There's another tool. My colleague, one of my colleagues and I were talking last night, and she's recommending Me and White Supremacy. I'm told that it comes with a workbook, in that it provides a lot of guidance. There are a few lists out there. One of them, I believe, is 70 actions that white people can do to help fight white supremacy. And there are a few different things out there. But I think more importantly than anything, because the world will open up when we state, as a part of our personal philosophy, a part of our religious philosophy, that we're anti-racist, that we're anti-white supremacy. And, you know, with the Christian faith, it's not until you voice that you've accepted Christ as your Lord and Savior that you're actually saved. You know, it's not until you've taken that first step. And then, I mean, who was a mature Christian after that first, you know, moment where you accepted Christ in your life? And so it's a journey, and it starts with recognizing that something is wrong and that there's an answer to it. And so I would recommend initially those two, and then you know, there's Tim Wise. He's and I do recommend that people read books and seek sources that are initially, especially in their initial journey, that are written by whites who have been on this journey for a long time, because they understand how whites process information, and they've done a lot of the work already, because what I've seen is that many whites have become experts in deflecting the truth, because that truth challenges goodness that we all think is within us. And so, you know, and that goodness around race and position, because really what Blacks are asking for is whites to share power. It's not, I know for a lot of secular Blacks, it's not about love. It's about having equal access to power, resources, being able to really grab hold of the American dream. And I think that many people, if they understand that the United States was founded on racism and revisit history with that in mind and understand how we got here. In the 13th Amendment, it abolishes slavery, but there's this one exception, and it literally says accept. And that accept keeps slavery alive. It makes it where we might think that it's completely off the books, off the record, but that accept provides institutions, states access to those tools of slavery. You know, they led to the convict leasing laws. And so I think that taking a journey through American history will also help people understand that really the forms of white supremacy have morphed, but the outcomes are very similar. You know, it was in Chicago, it said that the average person walking around on the streets, and this is pre-COVID-19, the average Black person on the streets had $8 to their name, right, for that day. And so you ask yourself, how did we get to that point? And working backwards. And for me, I asked myself, at what point in history were Blacks ever allowed to reach those levels that our white immigrant, who people often like to compare us to, you know, not the pilgrims, but the immigrants, how they were able to establish their hold in society. And one of the ways that they were was that the government recognized those white immigrants' struggle, recognized their, you know, what journey they had to take, and they put safety nets in place. They put ladders in place for them. You know, much of the land in the West and the Midwest were, you know, the United States felt like that land needed to be populated by whites. And so they made it very favorable for whites to explore that land and to own that land, and help them by providing them land for colleges. After, I forget which war it was, providing them access, because they recognized that, okay, every American, white American, should own a home, and that will help them build wealth from a generational sense. And for Blacks, they said, you can only live in these areas. And this was driven by the US government. After slavery, you know, it was seen that Blacks needed 40 acres and a mule in order to really take hold after slavery. And that was abandoned. And so, you know, just really taking a look at American history, and with the understanding that things were put in place to actually prevent, discourage Black progress. and it's all under the name of white supremacy. It was Nixon who said that that the United States had two enemies, and that was the black population and the hippies. And he said that if we could fill their community with drugs and then police them day and night and parade them around on television to build up this animus towards them, that they could be controlled, and that's what happened. And so I think just recognizing those historical events and accepting them as truths, that I think that helps as well. I know it helped me. So, I'm sorry that I can't provide just this litany of resources, but it's out there. It too is the water.
Yeah, and that's really, as we've talked about understanding and seeing races and beginning the journey to participating in eliminating it. It is, as you described it, a journey where there's a starting point. You don't start and instantly know everything or instantly understand everything. It's one step at a time, and so you start somewhere and begin to take step after step. And I think understanding history is understanding and believing history when you see it. The idea that if 40 acres and a mule had been given to every slave, that would have changed, I think, the trajectory of where we are. But instead, slaves were turned out. Said, you're free, but you have no money, no possessions. Everything you did own was now ours. So what are the options at that point with nothing? How do you feed your family? How do you survive?
You compound that with the other laws that were in place. So there was a law that says that it was the vagrancy laws. My cousin, who's only 70, probably 75, I believe now, he lived during a time where in Colorado, you had to have $20 or $30 in your pocket if a cop picked you up. And if you didn't have cash in your pocket, you're considered a vagrant. And who was more likely to be picked up for vagrancy than a black person? Because it's just assumed that they don't have any money. And so, right, it's exactly what you said. It's those, it becomes cruel at some point to even suggest that blacks should be at a different level than where they are now, given all of the hurdles that were placed in front of them.
Yeah. It's important, I think, to admit that and to not be afraid to say, this is real. This is part of our history. My family, my ancestors lived in Missouri, white folks in the deep South, and undoubtedly, I am where I'm at. I've benefited from white supremacy in my past, and I don't know where or how, but I have to admit that, and it's ugly, and it is shameful, and yet it's true, and I have to admit that. And admitting that then gives me a bit of freedom to say, okay, let's face this ugly thing and seek the truth rather than hide it or pretend it's not there. And that gives freedom to then open that door, not be afraid of what I see behind that door. Yeah, great first steps. And again, you've shared with me a lot of resources, many resources. So if anybody is curious and wants to know any of the things that you've mentioned or other things you've sent me, I can definitely anyone contact me. I can get them information on the list you've mentioned or some of the books and resources. So I can certainly help people on their journey as well. Um, I want to transition to then practical as we kind of wrap up this discussion. I love our talk, and it's very beneficial. And hopefully, maybe in the future, we can have another interview or two, maybe with people sending in questions or giving me questions that we can address. But for this interview this time, I wanted to end kind of on a practical level. What are some things that maybe white folks do to inadvertently discourage the movement that's happening? I'm sure, denying that there's racism is obviously the big one, but what are some ways perhaps that we that are maybe more subtle that inadvertently discourage the progress that's being made? Are there any ways that you can think of or put in words for us?
Yeah, I think that what works greatest against the Black struggle is it's very effective. It's diversion. It's when a Black person is killed, by a white person. It's and Blacks bring up that instance that they began to talk about Black on Black crime, which isn't, which is, like I said, very effective, without recognizing that when it comes to crimes, the person who's most likely to assault, to harm an individual is people from their own community, and that's across the board. And so to see these protests, riots, and not recognizing that many of the looters are white, to recognize, to talk about property damage when a man was killed on camera, and be more passionate about the property damage than the man who's killed on the camera. To somehow attempt to rationalize the death of another individual where they wouldn't for any other person. Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And it's all, many liberal, because under white supremacy, there are systems. There's schools, there's the education system, there's the housing system, there's just so many hospitals, all those different systems. And so, and they all work in concert with each other, in holding Blacks down, holding them back. And so just doing research and understanding how they do it, and then fighting those systems of oppression. When it comes to housing, understanding that any housing bill that benefits Black people will naturally benefit white people more. It's disingenuous to say that there's going to be any legislation that will benefit Black people more than white people, because that's just not fact. And we see it in people with disabilities. When we address an issue around disability, non-disabled people benefit usually more. When you think about the ramps that we put up to many buildings now, or requiring elevators in buildings, and those were all put in place for people with disabilities. But now the woman who is pregnant, the elderly person, the person who just doesn't feel like walking, up those flights of stairs now benefits Um, and so, you know, understanding that, yeah, you know, understanding where this passion comes from when it comes to Black causes, and exploring that. Yeah, you know, how can you go from being, um, you know, very even keel to irate by the very mention of something? What drives that? Yeah.
There's things that I think we we have to be willing to explore that we do that are discouraging and demotivating and actually harmful to the cause of the oppressed in this situation. So obviously we want to break those down in our own life and stop those. So on the flip side, I mean, there's things that we do to discourage inadvertently or perhaps on purpose. What can we do actively to encourage and empower the movement that's occurring now to those who are oppressed around us? You mentioned a few, but what are some other ways? Can you think of other ways that we can not discourage what's going on, but actually encourage and support what's going on?
Yeah, so I would say more than anything, it's recognizing that white supremacy is a thing, um, and not just as a concept, but an actual living, breathing thing. I call it a beast, and it's not satisfied um, with a pound of flesh. It wants it all, um, and so, you know, recognizing that is key, and also standing behind um, Blacks when you witness an incident of injustice, especially as a white male. It carries so much more weight. I was standing in line at an airport, and um, and I had been there. So I think the flight had changed, and they had to they had to reissue tickets or something to that effect. And so a line had formed on the opposite side of the desk, and an attendant um, came, and he went to the white guy, and to who had um, stepped up minutes after I had, um, and he pointed towards me with, you know, an air of um, dismay and a little bit of disgust, and he said he was here first. Um, and you know, and some people say, you know, you want to err on the side of caution. Um, well, who's most harmed? And I think that we have to ask ourselves that question. You know, to err on the side of caution, we have to first say, well, who's the victim? Who's the potential victim? And then move in that regard. Because oftentimes we're saying, um, let's not challenge this seemingly white supremacist action until we have to, not recognize, well, refusing to recognize, because truth stands on its own, right? It doesn't, um, it doesn't, um, it's impenetrable, it's unsinkable, it's what God, um, it's the foundation of his word. Um, and so by standing on that, um, we are um, invincible. Um, but I say, and so it becomes delusional to fight truth, because truth will always prevail. Um, and so I would say that recognizing what truth is, doing that research, you know, standing behind people who are being oppressed, in no difference from we would stand behind a person who was molested as a child, no different from we would a woman who was raped. Um, you know, understanding that generations are being impacted by these actions, and that you know, and not, you know, because I hear a lot of times, you know, how long must we fight? When do we know when there's equality? Um, and for me, it's let's. Why is that the question? Um, why isn't the question? Um, why aren't we all? Why don't we all have the opportunity, the same opportunities? Because in almost every statistic you look at, when you break it out around by races, that it's blacks who are um, disadvantaged. And so instead of asking for more systems, or not even systems, but more solutions, we're asking, is that solution necessary? You know, and so that's what I would say. You know, write your senator. Um, stand up for individual injustices when you see them. Yeah, march, because now, you know, this movement is a global thing, and it's sad when you see Christians who are still refusing. I mean, secular people are out there risking their lives, and Christians are safely at home questioning it. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it's as you list off the things that we can do, I'm reflecting, realizing oftentimes we want a quick fix. You know, we want, well, if I just, my action that I need to take is just, you know, read a book and then I'm done, or send a tweet and then I'm done. The reality is, what I'm hearing you say is that we need to participate in the hard things. Admitting that there's white supremacy is hard. You have to fight your defensiveness. You have to investigate and dig in, and you have to fight a lot of things to admit that. Standing behind those who are oppressed and those who are experiencing injustice is a hard thing, because there are those questions of, oh, this might be awkward, or is this really, what's their intention? Maybe I'm misinterpreting it, you know, like you say, to hold back and to not do that is harmful. And so, you know, as I think through even this last week, there's been several people that have mentioned something about the protests, and to speak out and kind of help them think differently is hard. It can be embarrassing and you don't know what to say. But those are things that are kind of ongoing steps that we take, and it's not just one and done. Okay, this is the finish line. I'll just do this action and now I can forget about it, which is easy for us to do as white folks, because it's not part of our experience to experience this oppression. It's not part of our daily experience, but to step into that, to lend our voice to the oppressed, and to take on the cause of the oppressed, just as Christ did. You know, he could have said, you know, those humans, you know, they're too bad. They're oppressed by sin. I hope it gets better for them. No, he came and he became a human. He took on our burden unnecessarily, and that is what I'm hearing you say, that we need to take on the burden that is ours because we are human, but to walk alongside in in the long run, not just until this dip falls, but to continue and make it a part of our life. So yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I really have appreciated our conversations. They've been very beneficial to me, and hopefully our conversation here today is beneficial to those who watch and those who listen. And again, it's not the end of our conversations, but hopefully this is at least the start of a journey for those who watch it. And it would be great if we could at some point in the future connect again. And I've really enjoyed this format of interview, and I found it helpful to me, and hopefully others have as well. So thank you again, Mims, and we'll plan to talk again in the future.
Okay, and thank you for inviting me to sit down with you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.